This conference will now be recorded.
I just would like to welcome you this morning. My name is Deborah Tufel. I am the President and CEO of the Hutchinson-Reno County Chamber of Commerce. And coming back to moderate a conference in Wichita is kind of like coming home for me because, for many of you know, for many years I was at the Wichita Chamber working for the Greater Wichita Economic Development Coalition. I was there for about 8 years in that role. And really enjoying my time in Hutchinson, but sure enjoyed my time in Wichita. And so, and spent years before that working in a couple of other rural counties within the metro, in Sumner and Cowley County. So it's quite an honor that Wichita State invited me to come back and moderate this conference. Please help yourself to the refreshments around the room. We want to continue to remind you to silence your cell phones for today. At least put them on vibrate, if you will. There is a Twitter hashtag shown at the bottom of the slides this morning. We want to remind you to utilize that and get the word out on social media about this great event. And also note that the speakers' presentations will be available on wire.cedbr.org. So you don't even need to take notes. You can go home and all of those presentations will be there for you later. With that, at this time, I would like to welcome to the stage our presenting sponsor this morning from Intrust Bank. Please help me welcome Jay Smith, President and Chief Operating Officer of Intrust Bank Wichita.
Thanks, Deborah. On behalf of everyone at Intrust Bank, I'd just like to welcome you to this morning's event. Intrust has been a part of the Wichita and Kansas community for over 140 years. And I think as the state and the city have grown, we've been fortunate to participate in that growth as well. As the city and the state have evolved to meet the needs of its citizens, I'd like to think that we've been able to change and evolve in terms of the products and services we provide to our customers and communities. But one thing that I'd like to point out for us anyway has been that the constant has been the core values associated with our institution. The Chandler family has played a large part in the leadership of our organization for much of its history. We're currently on our 4th generation of Chandler family leadership, and the 5th generation's at the bank. So we're focused on the future there as well. But one of the basic business tenets of Charlie's great-grandfather was that you do business with people, not companies. We believe that. We talk about that a lot. Relationships are important to us, and our relationships and dealings with customers and communities extend throughout the state. That's why we're so very much interested in today's topic. I'd also like to take just a real brief moment to put a plug in for the Center for Economic Development and Business Research. That's really kind of a mouthful for me. I always have a problem with it. But we've been very fortunate to partner with the center for the past few years. We actually had Patty in the bank earlier this week speaking to a group and providing some insights on a topic that many of us were interested in. I can tell you that they do a great job at taking massive amounts of data and distilling that in a way that even simpletons like me can kind of understand. And there's information that is provided that you can use to help manage your business. They're very willing to share their knowledge, and so I would just encourage all of you to view them as a key resource for you and to take advantage of everything that the center offers. So with that, again, thank you for being here. We're very, very honored to be able to partner with CDBR on this event. And Deborah, I'll turn it back over to you.
It is quite a mouthful, isn't it? We always say CEDBR, which doesn't even roll off of the tongue very well either, but they do produce a wonderful amount of research, and we have quite a lot of that expertise this morning. Our first speaker, we're just going to jump right in, is going to speak to us this morning about benchmarking the urban and rural trends. And I can tell you, as a community that is somewhat on the edge of the western front of Kansas, that rural-urban divide is so real. I was just commiserating with some folks this morning that the time doesn't get any shorter between Hutchinson and Wichita, especially when they are overlaying Yoder Road. And I took a picture this morning to prove it. There was a traffic jam on Yoder Road. I kid you not. We're doing an overlay project and they have a flag card that stops you. And so I'm like texting this morning saying, I'm going to be just a little bit late and I can't do anything about it. But anyway, and if you see my truck outside, I'm driving a Hutch Chamber truck that is like a driving billboard. So there is no breaking the speed limit in that thing because you are not inconspicuous whatsoever. But our first speaker, he actually hails from Hutchinson. I learned that he's a Bueller High graduate. He actually coaches the debate team at Hutch High, but in his day job, he is the research assistant at CEDVR at Wichita State. Help me welcome to the stage, Evan Hoblitzel.
Hello, everybody. So we're here today to give you a bit of background about the trends in urban and rural communities. Some of these are going to surprise you, some maybe not so much. So we're going to look at some population trends, which is probably most worrying to a lot of people here, employment and income, education, and then our forecasted growth for both metropolitan and rural areas. So let's start by defining our metro, micro, and rural areas. So for the purposes of today's presentation, our metro and micro areas are outlined here on the map. As you can see, some of the areas that are considered metropolitan or micropolitan might seem a little more rural to a lot of us who live in Wichita. We've got Kearney and Finney County out there in western Kansas, Seward, Ford. And while those areas might seem pretty rural, they are much more urban than a lot of those areas up in northwest Kansas that have much smaller populations. There we go. Okay, so this chart here is going to show you national trends between the metropolitan areas, the US as a whole, and then non-metro areas. So this is probably what you're thinking about when you're thinking about the state of rural areas in the United States, which is that over the past about 40, 50 years, the rate of growth and population growth in the area in non-metro areas has declined significantly. Important to note that it generally tracks with recessions. If you look at it, you can tell it's not exactly as recessions happen, but a lot of these rural areas, as recessions happen, people start moving out, people start choosing not to have children, and that's a trend that takes many years to reverse after a recession. And each time, as you can tell, it doesn't quite go back up to the same level of growth as it was before. And this is why we're seeing rural areas start to reach this point where they're starting to have school closures and consolidation as they're losing population because of people moving to those metropolitan areas. Now, it's important to note this isn't a disaster happening because it just in the post-2010 era became less than zero. So we actually just started seeing population decline in about the last 10 years or so, even though those growth rates have been declining for a long time. And it's starting to tick back up. Which means that the rural areas are starting to see that long recovery from the 2008 Great Recession and are starting to tip back upwards. Now, urban trends do also show declining growth rates. That's important to note as well, is that urban areas are also not growing nearly the rate they were in the 1970s as those areas start to have lower birth rates and fewer people moving in. Now, this is a map of population growth rates in Kansas. So as you can see, areas in the kind of upper quintile of growth are clustered around our metropolitan areas. So your population growths are still happening in places around Kansas, but those are mostly going to be your metropolitan areas, while your areas that are completely rural, don't border metro areas, are starting to see declining growth rates. Now, this means that we basically are looking at two different kind of rural areas. We're looking at metro adjacent, and then we're looking at areas that are completely rural. And that's important when you're thinking about kind of business expansion or looking at those population trends, is that if an area is within a reasonable drive to a metropolitan area, they're in a much better position to retain population than an area that's completely rural and isn't even close to any metro or micropolitan areas. Now, this is also consistent with national trends, where there's a lot of growth in kind of your suburban areas, but completely rural, also we're seeing little to no growth. So with that in mind, we paint a picture of the population in the rural areas of Kansas as declining slowly and as growth rates that have been declining for several years. Next, let's look at employment and income, which is actually a little bit different than those population trends, and we're actually seeing some positive areas. Now, this is a map of employment change from 2008 to 2017. So as you can see, if you look at the legend down there, there's some areas that have had very, very negative employment change, almost negative 37%. And then we have areas that have had some really decent growth in the green there. And as you can see, it's not exactly consistent with rural areas. You're seeing some rural areas that have actually had pretty decent employment growth, which means it's not exactly tracking with population trends. We're seeing some growth in areas like Cheyenne and Rawlins County way up there in the Northwest. Now, if you are looking for some trends, you can see that in Southeast Kansas, there's been a lot of negative employment growth. Not a lot of positive growth there until you move up northwest a little bit, or just straight north into Northeast Kansas. So that is very consistent when we look at the employment numbers throughout different industries, is that we're seeing Southeast Kansas is the only area where we're seeing a lot of consistent employment decreases. Throughout the rest of the state, you can see it's rather patchy with areas in the upper quintile throughout rural as well as urban areas. Gets a little more interesting when you're looking at annual average household income. And you can see that a lot of our rural counties actually have very high average household incomes, which means even though we're seeing declining population, the people that are still living there actually seem to have a pretty decent quality of life, in that they are able to afford things and have a relatively high income. Once again, this is bucked by Southeast Kansas, which, as you can see, has a large collection of states in the bottom two quintiles. But in that Northwest Kansas and Southwest Kansas area that's also very, very rural, you're seeing a lot of counties that are actually very high in the household income ranking in the upper quintile, which means that we really can't stand up here and tell you that rural areas are completely impoverished or that rural areas are seeing declining income. They're actually not really following any particular trend other than the fact that they're not declining with their own population. And this is once again consistent when we move to the percentage of people below the poverty line. So this is where we're actually looking at rural poverty. Once again, Southeast Kansas is the only area where we see very consistent high percentages of people in poverty. If we're looking at Northwest and Southwest Kansas, it's very patchy. Some areas are very, very low poverty rates with very few people, down to even 4% in some areas, while we actually have higher poverty in some of our urban areas. You look at Ford and Finney County, which are micropolitan areas. Those are actually some of the highest rates of poverty in Western Kansas. And then if you look over Sedgwick, Reno, and kind of central Kansas, we see that they're also towards in the top two quintiles of poverty rates as well. So we really aren't seeing a consistent trend, once again, other than Southeast Kansas as far as poverty in our state. Now it gets more interesting when we start to talk about education. Education, generally speaking, the traditional wisdom is that your higher levels of education perfectly correlate, well, not perfectly, but generally correlate with higher levels of income. However, if we're looking at some of the rural areas in Kansas, we see that that's not necessarily true. So this is the percentage of states with bachelor's degrees or higher. And what's interesting is that a lot of your Southwest Kansas counties, as you can see, are grouped together with some of the lowest percentages of people with bachelor's degrees. But we still have those areas that also have relatively high income, and we're in the upper quintile in the state of Kansas. So that tells us that in Western Kansas, if we're talking about ways to bring businesses there. We've got people who are expecting or have high paying jobs in the area, but don't necessarily have high levels of education. So we're not looking for really high white collar jobs, high paying white collar jobs that come in there. The more high paying blue collar jobs that don't require as high levels of education. It gets even more interesting. Look at areas that have less than a high school diploma by percentage. Once again, we have Southwest Kansas with some of the highest levels of people that don't have a high school diploma, but once again, those are still people with high paying jobs. So it's very interesting when we're talking about what life is like in rural areas in Kansas, because the traditional wisdom of go to school, get a degree so you can get a higher paying job doesn't necessarily hold true in those areas. And when we're trying to think ways to bring business to people in the area, the traditional may not work in getting people back there. Now, with that in mind, we've discussed a little bit about the population trends in the rural areas, which indicates they're going to continue probably to decline. We looked a little bit at our income, and we can see that income really is different throughout the state. We looked at poverty and see that that's not really clustered anywhere specific either. So with that in mind, let's look at where CEDBR's latest forecast update actually puts us as far as those urban and rural areas. So first, Kansas as a whole, we do expect to grow employment by about 1.1% in 2019. So pretty decent return to growth compared to 2017. But that is not necessarily even throughout the state. So as you can see, Kansas City, Wichita, and Topeka, 3 metro areas, are all forecasted to grow around between 0 and 2%. But then our non-metropolitan areas, so your more rural areas, are forecasted to kind of hover around 0 to stay relatively flat as far as employment growth goes. And the reason is, one of the reasons is, of course, because if you don't have the labor force available and the population available, it's hard to continue employment growth. So even though we see that a lot of these rural areas are having decent employment growth, especially if they're metropolitan adjacent, we see that they have relatively high income. The fact is there is an upper limit at a certain point if you don't have the population in order to actually work at these new businesses that are coming into the area. So a brief summary, we can see that rural population growth is declining in sparsely populated areas. Counties near metro areas are more likely to have growing populations. Employment growth is mixed and doesn't really follow urban or rural lines. And then rural areas are forecast to grow much slower than the rest of the state, partially at least because of that lack of population. And I believe I do have a little bit of time left. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes.
Not a question, but a comment. Your first chart information was that since the 1970s, declining rural population. You need to go back and look because that's been the cycle since the 1870s, not just the 1970s. If you go back to the early settlers, grasshopper invasions, and real estate market collapses and droughts, and those kind of issues, we have watched farm population decline as the labor was replaced by efficient machines, et cetera, down through the course of 150 years.
Right, and that is important, as a lot of those rural areas had peak population over a century ago or close to a century ago. And it's important to note those rates are declining, but they didn't reach below 0 until very recently. So some of those areas did still have very slow population growth even after those mass exoduses with the Depression and the increases in automation.
Hand labor with equipment labor, you get down to where you only need so many people to farm all that ground or to handle all those cattle and feedlot or whatever. So there's a sort of a stable number, and you don't need to grow it.
Right, and so that becomes the issue of if you're someone who's looking to expand into rural areas, or if you're someone who is maybe lending in rural areas or looking to bring people, if you are in one of those governments, you need to start looking beyond agriculture to find businesses that can actually bring people to your area. As agriculture becomes more and more automated, those areas that are dependent upon it really don't need as high of a population to continue to function and to continue to produce the commodities that come out of that agriculture. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Who are the major employers in Southwest Kansas?
In Southwest Kansas, I don't know that off the top of my head. I know that there is a lot of feedlots and meat packing in like your Ford and Finney County areas, but I don't know the exact companies that would be. All right, I think we're ready to move on to our next speaker.
Thank you, Evan, for that great information. It's definitely evident Kansas is a patchwork quilt in some respects, but yet the rural area continues to grow. I love seeing the Wichita State data that helps us really drive home that the rural areas have challenges, and it's up to us to figure out how do we address those challenges. I can tell you a challenge that I didn't anticipate when I first came to Hutchinson was shortly on the heels of my arrival there, Target decided to close their retail establishment in Hutchinson. Now, if you want to see an uprising in Hutchinson, close the Target store. They actually held a candlelight vigil, I kid you not, for the Target. So, but that it's true that you can be out in the rural area and you think, you know, you've got a strong, stable economy, but when you are on the edge of a metropolitan, those amenities are available, and the Amazon effect is having a real impact as well in the retail sector. So thanks for driving that data home for us, Evan. The next topic is about our changing political environment, and I will tell you that sometimes I have said economic development is the perfect career if you could take the politics out of it, but you can't. The reality is that we need that political environment to provide some stability and policy changes that help us drive good policy decisions. So this next round of legislative redistricting is promising to increase the representation of suburban areas in both Kansas legislature as well as the House, and the rural areas are going to lose representation. And so we have our next speaker who's going to talk to us about what all of that means. I had the pleasure of meeting her very briefly this morning. Gentry Teason is a Wichita State grad, recently graduated in the field of political science, and she's taken her first new professional role with the city of Wichita. So help me welcome to the stage, Gentry Teason.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here speaking with you today. So, as Deborah mentioned, I'll be talking to you about redistricting and partisanship in Kansas, specifically doing a case study of the 2012 redistricting cycle so we can evaluate what that might look like in 2022. So Kansas is entering a mandatory redistricting cycle in 2020 that necessitates the adjustment of congressional, state Senate, and state House of Representative district lines to comply with the data received from the federal government in 2020. This culminates with redistricting legislation to be voted on in 2022 that will decide geographic partisanship for the decade. So we heard from Evan a little bit about what the future looks like for redistricting, but or census data, but this is the census data that led to redistricting in 2010. A total of 6.1% population growth from 2000 to 2010, with the highest growth in the northeast corner of the state. 77 of 105 counties exhibited declines during that time, and 69 of those 77 counties with a decline are considered rural. And then Hispanic populations grew 59% to represent 10.5% of the population. So you can see that a lot of that area of concentration and growth is in Kansas City and our other metropolitan statistical areas, including, you know, out there in Finney and Kearney County. So the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s established the one person, one vote principle to make voting power equivalent among all voters in a state. Because there is no change in the number of seats, but a definite change in population demographic and numbers, there will be altered district locations in the next redistricting cycle. The guidelines state that congressional and state districts are to be contiguous, as compact as possible, and recognize and consider communities of common social, cultural, racial, ethnic, and economic interests. It also states that existing political divisions are to be preserved and to avoid contests between incumbents. And because of that population increase among the Hispanic communities that I mentioned in the last slide, that's something that will have to be considered in redistricting as a community of interest. So the ideological issues that presented in the 2011-2012 cycle of redistricting were that moderate Republicans in the Senate and conservative Republicans in the House would not confer to each other, as is typical in tradition, to draw their own chamber maps, because the Senate was willing to allow shifts in district that would make them more Democrat friendly, as well as shifting power from rural to urban areas, including Kansas City. Additionally, the House would not pass the Senate plan that gerrymandered for 3 moderate Republican senators facing more conservative challengers in their next election. So because of the failure of the legislature to adhere to the time limitations, a failure to adhere to guidelines, and explicit gerrymandering that took place, the maps were taken to the federal district court level to be drawn. So this is just a quote for you. For the first time in Kansas, redistricting was completed entirely by a district court. And I'll just read this. While legislators publicly demurred that they had done the best they could, the impasse resulted from a bitter ideological feud, largely over new Senate districts. The feud primarily pitted GOP moderates against their more conservative GOP colleagues. Failing consensus, the process degenerated into blatant efforts to gerrymander various districts for ideological political advantage and serve the political ambitions of various legislators. And that was from the district court for the state of Kansas that actually hosted the, redistricting in 2022. So the result were that the maps resulted in 48 representatives and 6 senators being placed in multi-incumbent challenge races, in which 26 Republicans and 4 Democrat incumbents would face a member of their own party in their re-election primaries. Both of these conditions are exactly what incumbents try to avoid at all costs when redistricting. So this map shows the redrawn congressional districts with the boundaries of the 2002 districts overlaid in black lines, so you can see what kind of changes took place. And I'm sorry that the colors are pretty light. Congressional districts 1 and 4 received little changes overall. The 2nd district, including Kansas City area, became more Democrat friendly, and the 3rd district, including Wyandotte County and Johnson County, all became more Republican. In 2022, the expectation is that District 3 will have to shed population, while the other 3 will add population in rural areas, including Topeka, which we'll lose. So for the 2020 redistricting cycle, the Kansas Legislative Research Department acts as a nonpartisan organizer of the federal census redistricting program. Kansas chose to opt into the first optional 2 phases, which include the Block Boundary Suggestion Project, which collects population and demographic data at the smallest geographic level, which is really important for communities of interest to recognize, and the Voting District Project, which allows the state to provide the Census Bureau with current precinct boundaries so that we receive precinct data again in the 2020 cycle. The final 3 phases are the delivery of data, the submission of maps, and a period of evaluation and recommendations from the Federal Census Bureau. As you can see by these demographic trends that are projected more long-term, by 2064, rural populations will decrease by 20%, and 69 of those 105 counties, as the 69 of the 77 I mentioned earlier, will drop by 33% of their population on average. And in 2064, again, 80% of the total population is expected to live in metropolitan areas, with the breakdown of that below. As far as coalition strength goes, with the election of a Democratic governor, Laura Kelly, over Chris Kobach at a time when Trump was 50% favorable in Kansas, this could be a reflection of another cycle of ideological feuds within the Republican Party. So as the 3rd congressional district elected an openly gay Native American woman over the incumbent Republican male, and the Democrat candidate was just narrowly defeated in the 2nd district, the state could pick up another Democratic seat possibly for the congressional districts in 2022, as well as many party switches that occurred in this last election within the Kansas legislature itself, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate, switches from Republican to Democratic representation. So the maps on this slide and the next slide were provided by Patrick Miller, a professor of political science from Kansas University. So of the 40 Senate districts, Laura Kelly won 21 and Chris Kobach won 19. 10 Senate districts held by Republicans were won by Kelly at this time. A point of note is that Laura Kelly won District 30, held by Senate Majority Leader Susan Wagle, who is a Republican in Wichita. And of the 125 districts, House districts, Kelly won 65 and Kobach won 40. 24 of the House districts held by Republicans were won by Laura Kelly. And in both the House and Senate maps, no Democrat districts were won by Kobach. Notably, House Leader Ron Reichman's District 78 was also won by Kelly. So to wrap up, the trajectory and identity of our young nation and the states within it are in transitory stages, and redistricting could be a reflection of how we navigate these changes in the coming decade. So what could this mean for redistricting in 2020? That depends on the shift to urban and Democrat areas like the northeast corner of the state in Wichita, who holds the governor's office in 2022, and coalition strength and division in the legislature, as well as partisan trends from the 2020 presidential election. What we can look for in 2020 are similar process challenges of the rural and urban divide in representation, as well as potential obstacles around ideological splits. Thank you. Are there any questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Gentry. I think the thing that stuck out to me most from that presentation and all that great data is that by 2064, 80% of the population is going to live in the metro areas of Kansas. That is just astounding. Kind of more astounding that we're talking about statistics that will be in the year 2064. I don't know how many of you did the math and thought, how old will I be in 2064? I will be 93 then. I hope I'm not even worrying about what the districts are by then. I hope I am just enjoying life somewhere and having my kids and grandkids with me. Great information, Gentry, and I think where do they pull out 2064? Why not 2065, 2060, like a 5-year or 10-year increment? I'm going to ask Gentry that question on the next break. So our next speaker is also going to talk a little bit about political environment in Kansas. Mr. Neil Allen is the chair and professor of political sciences at Wichita State. Let's welcome Neil to the stage and hear what great data he has to share with us. Welcome, Neil.
Okay, hello, and thank you to the CEBDR. I think I got that a little wrong. Political science is easier. And for the chance to talk here, and also thanks for inviting my recent student, Gentry Thiessen, who just graduated last week. And as an example of the evidence that I'm doing a good job when I teach, which is I succeed when I find out that my student knows way more about what I'm teaching than I do. And so what I want to talk about is rural-urban divide and possibly cooperation in Kansas politics. It's me? Well, that's too much. And so talking about the next kind of 10 years or so in Kansas politics, and just to jump to the end, it's confusing now, and it's going to be confusing for the next few years, and it's probably going to continue to be confusing. When I moved here to Kansas in 2011, it was the one period we thought we might have some kind of stability going forward with conservative Republicans in control, putting forward their vision for the next few decades, and that hasn't worked quite so well. So to start off, I just want to talk a little bit about where I come from and why this is important to me. I'm actually the product of rural-urban cooperation, and in some ways, somebody who comes out of a rural background and is able to be successful and contribute in an urban background. I myself, as you can probably tell, I'm not engaged in agriculture. I don't have those skills, but my father does. I come from a long line of Southern Indiana dirt farmers. I grew up in around Evansville, Indiana. Southern Indiana is kind of like Wichita or South Central Kansas. Smaller cities, lots of agriculture, except there are some differences. It's nowhere. It's a little bit colder, and it's nowhere near as flat or as windy. In Indiana, if you see like the sky is darkening, it's a dark shade of blue. The winds are blowing, gusting up to 30, 35 miles an hour, and the rain's blowing down. You think, oh, it's time for a tornado. We got to get in the basement. And here in Kansas, that was Tuesday. But men and women in my family have been farming the same ground in southern Indiana since 1868. My father is probably in his last year of farming. And that particular work and the resources that have been gained from that have made possible me to go to a good high school, to go to a good college, to go to graduate school, and also the willingness to take the risk of going into a career that tends to pay you a tiny amount for about 8 years and a mediocre amount for the rest of the time. And I didn't realize this so much until I got here at Wichita State University in the time of innovating through adversity, that the background of growing up on a farm was terribly important, especially in the willingness to work hard, to work in weird situations, and also to be the person in the room of faculty members saying, okay, that's fine, but what are we going to do about that? Because we faculty tend to talk about a lot. And also, it's sad for me that my father would be the last farmer. Actually, the spot where Allen's have been farming since 1868 is about ready to be a CVS pharmacy in a couple of years, because it's in a hospital complex, actually. But I still thankfully have memory of this from my relatives. And also, there's a man named Studs Terkel who did a bunch of oral histories that some of you might have read, like The Good War, for example. And my grandfather was in his most important book called Working, that I'm going to refer to just in a minute. So I'm going to talk a little bit about current Kansas politics, make some references to the late John Bardo, our president of the university, and his understanding of Kansas. Talk about Bob Dole for a little bit, because you can't talk about Kansas politics without talking about Bob Dole. And I'm also end with talking a bit about the future. So I want to start where Gentry ended here and talk about the kind of opportunities that are there for Democrats and in the near future. So a good way to see partisanship and opportunity in legislatures is look at the top of the ticket vote in various districts. So Gentry made reference to the fact that Laura Kelly, the Laura Kelly governor's campaign, won plurality of the vote, meaning not necessarily a majority, but more votes than anybody else. Because remember, we did have a third-party candidate, Greg Orman, that got a significant amount of votes, although nowhere near as many as he thought he was going to. But Governor Kelly won a majority of the vote and won the most votes in a majority of state Senate districts and state House districts. I want to concentrate a bit on the state Senate here. So in the state Senate, if the Democrats just hold all of their own districts, which they probably can in the next election, although they do have a couple they might have some trouble holding. One's here in Wichita. Lynn Rogers' old district is about 50-50 between the parties. Democrats ought to be able to hold it in most situations, although their candidate is new to electoral office and her other job is owning a couple CBD shops, and I'm not sure Kansas is quite ready for that kind of candidate. But there's like 20 CBD shops I drive past every day. I still don't understand the world. And also Laura Kelly's old district actually could go to a Republican, particularly considering the Democrat in that district just was arrested for DUI. But if the Democrats hold those two districts and pick up every district that Laura Kelly won a majority of the votes in, or a plurality of votes in, then they can have a majority in the state Senate. The state Senate is a little bit more likely than the state House just because it's a smaller number, and if you get lucky, then maybe you can get a majority. And there's some pretty sobering numbers for some Republicans. On this chart, what I did is I took the margin of Laura Kelly. Also, I'll talk about the 16 election in a little bit. Also, that's the 2016 margin is the margin of victory of the people in that race, although there's a couple asterisks there because there's a couple of people who are in districts that were appointed to be those districts. So that's the previous incumbent. Like you see, Eric Rucker is in the 20th district around Topeka. Vicki Schmidt is our insurance commissioner now. She won that district by 31 percentage points. Rucker's not going to do that likely because he's a very, very conservative legislator. Schmidt was a moderate, but still incumbents tend to have advantages. But notice we have Kelly winning majority in not just up in Johnson County, but also in places around here like Senator Wagel's district where I live and Senator Peterson's district. And so there's a lot of opportunity for the Democrats. And also Medicaid expansion is a policy issue which seems to have a majority, at least of Kansans, for it, although you can move that majority around a lot depending on how you ask the question. And certainly had a majority of votes in the state House. It's got a majority of votes in the state Senate, but not enough to get past procedural rules. But there's a lot of vulnerability for Republicans who voted no on Medicaid expansion in the next election. So what we have here, though, is we have at least the kind of outlines of a possible urban-suburban majority that doesn't really need to get a lot of votes from rural areas, in the sense that Laura Kelly, while she won a majority, a clear plurality of the vote statewide, she got more votes than Kobach in a majority of districts in both state house and state senate. That's almost entirely in urban and suburban areas, particularly if you count a place like Salina as a small urban area. And so you can at least see the kind of outlines of Kansas in a very good Democratic year, looking like a state like Illinois. If you look at a map of Illinois by like county vote for president, majority of counties in Illinois vote Republican, and Republican consistently, even in the old downstate coal mining Democratic areas, they're voting Republican. But Illinois still is a strongly Democratic area because where all the people are and where most of the votes are, the Democrats do very well and are doing better over time. At the end, I'm going to return to why that might not necessarily be true. But it's interesting in the sense you might see the outlines of maybe a majority coalition in Kansas that doesn't depend upon rural votes. Now, I want to go to the question of the kind of identity of Kansas and how that fits into our politics. I want to go back to 2012 to actually a speech that was given in a different room in this very building with the inauguration of the late John Bardo as president of Wichita State University. And just on a personal note, I'm one of the many people who was mentored by President Bardo, and his particular vision of both applied learning and connecting classroom to real world, and the idea of positive risk-taking was probably one of the many things that made it possible for me to get tenure and have a job and feed my kids for the rest of my life. So I remember seeing this speech that Bardo made in the old sanctuary building room here in the Metroplex. And Bardo was talking about a lot of kind of sociological data. He was a sociologist by trade. And also I was watching Governor Brownback, who the first time I'd seen him, and he had introduced the president of the university. And this is a quote that I noticed Governor Brownback was kind of, spacing a little bit. And then he's like, oh, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me because it didn't fit his experience, my guess, having been agriculture commissioner of Kansas and then senator. So Bardo said, when after discussing about the rural heritage of Kansas and the importance of the farm culture and partly the cowboy culture, he said, we are more correctly a low population urban state than a rural state. Now, what might this mean? Well, most of the people in Kansas we've talked about actually live in rural areas, particularly if you consider kind of micropolitan areas like Dodge City or Salina to be urban areas. Actually, the first district of Kansas, which we see on one of the maps Gentry showed, the big first that includes about 2/3 of the state, that district actually has, by the census, the lowest commute time to work of any district in the country. Now, part of that is because a lot of people they work where they live, and so they're on farms, but also a lot of that population is actually still in urban areas or near small urban areas. And also, even if you're living, 30 miles away from Hutchinson or Dodge City, you can get there in 30 minutes. Unlike, if you're, living 30 miles away from Overland Park, you can't very well get there in 30 minutes in the morning. And so Bardo was saying that we're trying to make an argument that we're an urban state and we need to focus on urban areas in order to have population growth and also economic growth. And he says, don't get me wrong, we know that agricultural product processing, here referencing the big growth area in employment in rural and small town Kansas, which is the meatpacking areas in the Southwest, and natural resource development will always be critical to the state. And then he states that we understand that, and Bardo had this way of basically trying to include all of you in what he said. He was wonderful at actually having a room of people and getting everyone to think that they actually agreed with what he thought. And then also, if you were at high levels of the institution, which I wasn't at that point and still are not, what you would find out is not only do you agree with what John's going to do, you're also going to do things that John just decided you were going to do that you didn't necessarily know about before. My friends in criminal justice still talk about the week they learned that they were going to do an all online master's degree and bachelor's degree too, which has been quite successful. But things at Wichita State have been moving much faster than a lot of us have been real comfortable with. Although I'm okay with that because I'd rather be on Team Future. And in higher education, if you keep doing stuff the way we've been doing it forever, it's not going to work. If nothing else, we can't go up to Topeka and justify these kind of things. I've been on a group that works on if we ever have to defend tenure from the legislature wanting to eliminate it, like it's happened in a lot of other states, we have to talk about arguments for that. And for me, tenure is compensation, and also the reason why we should have tenure is if we don't, we just won't get the best aerospace engineers in the world, for example, to come to Wichita State University, because they can go someplace else and make 5 times as much, and we got to give them something, and job security is one of the ways of doing that. So back on to what Bardo was saying, he was trying to inspire all of us for the new vision he was going to have for the rest of his life. And he said here, people are talking about, we understand that people of Kansas are increasingly urban and increasingly metropolitan, and it's exactly what is happening all around the world. And people are moving out of rural areas into cities, and that's the national global trend, and it's reflected here. And I was just actually noting that kind of trend affects even people like me that grow up in a kind of rural background, and also but look for employment. And so in my line of work, there's very little employment in rural areas. And so if I'm going to work, I need to work in the city, even though that's what I like. It's kind of set for me. And I actually noticed in this oral history of my grandfather back from, this book was in 1973, he's referring to my father, who for a very brief time thought he wasn't going to be a farmer. And my grandfather was referring to my father, who at the time was working in the mobile home construction industry in a factory in Georgia, said, it seems like if they once they get out and go to college, there's very few of them do come back. They realized that as far as the future and the money could be made from farming, it just wasn't there. So there was one thing that turned his mind away from it. Of course, he can always change, I'm hoping. And it turned out that my father would come home very soon and spend the rest of his life on the farm. But Bardo here is talking about this kind of conflict between rural and urban, and the fact that even in a state which defines itself partly as as rural, that has a strong farm heritage, that our future to a great extent of where our people are going to be, where a lot of our economic production is going to be in urban and suburban areas. And so this gets to a kind of idea about, or at least a debate about what our state's going to be. And in some ways, because we are always going to be a state that has lots of rural area, lots of places that are going to have people living there, but the population is going to be pretty thin. And also they're going to have cities that are going to be growing, at least we hope that it's growing. There's a kind of debate here there's a couple of ways of conceiving of this. One is it going to be about a rural past versus a metropolitan future, or is it about going forward together or separating ourselves? So when we think about the first question, in some ways, is a false dichotomy, because the metropolitan future we have in Kansas is built upon our rural past, and in some ways about our rural future. Because if you think about it, like I get to go to all kinds of places to buy stuff here in Wichita, and pretty much all the stuff I want to buy, I can buy in Wichita. But the people in those stores are also very often coming from rural areas around, because we're a collector of retail. We're also a collector of healthcare. And so where Wichita's core employment for a long time has been aircraft manufacturer, that has been going down over time as there's been automation, there's been efficiencies, there's been other players in the world like Brazil and China that have been successful at taking a lot of the market share that used to be here. You have all kinds of regulatory issues like what's going on now with Boeing and Spirit involving the MAX 8. But what you have, though, is all kinds of rural inflow of money and resources into the urban areas, because like in the last 20 years or so, as we've had declining industrial employment, we've had increasing service sector employment, particularly for healthcare, because the nature of modern healthcare is that it isn't able to be delivered in rural areas. And this is actually one of the big kind of issues in the legislature these days, is about how do you deal with that. Medicaid expansion is the big ticket item, the idea of trying to pump more money into rural areas through leveraging federal dollars with state dollars. Also, there was from my perspective, very sadly, a bill that got gutted in the last legislature, the Nurse Practitioner Independence Bill, or whatever it's called. This was a bill that would allow nurse practitioners to work more or less independent from doctors, which is very relevant for lots of rural areas, because there are a lot of rural areas where there is no doctor nearby, or if there is a doctor, he's 75 years old and he's not going to get replaced. But you can get a nurse practitioner out there. But if she, it's most likely going to be a she, is going to have to be dependent for supervision on someone who lives 2 hours away, they have to drive to once a week, that's not the best working environment. There's a bill in the legislature that was going to change this in the last legislature, except it became the Democrats and the moderates' best vehicle to gut something and replace it with Medicaid expansion because the leadership in the House didn't want it. And so that the nurse practitioner bill that might very well have passed was killed for a session, and Medicaid expansion didn't pass either. And so really we have both a metropolitan future built upon a rural past and somewhat a rural future. I would say instead the better way to think about it, and especially when you talk about our politics, is do we want to go forward together or do we want to find ways to separate? And sadly, we're already separating a lot in our politics. The last 2 elections for president in 2016 and Congress then, and especially in 2018 for Congress, shows a massive sorting out based on rural areas and urban areas. The big urban areas are becoming more Democratic. The smaller and rural areas and small cities are becoming more Republican. And that is the reason, for example, why even in the national wave of Democratic victories in Congress, the 2nd district, which in Kansas, or the U.S. House, which includes Topeka, Lawrence, and most of southeast Kansas, it stayed Republican, even though it had a very well-funded and quality Democratic candidate, Paul Davis, a frankly fairly weak Republican candidate in Steve Watkins, and a lot of money, both national and local, behind the Democrats. But there's a lot of rural areas in that district. Topeka and Lawrence are urban, and they went strongly Democratic, but there was just too much rural for Paul Davis to overcome. And this has all kinds of complicating issues in our politics. Rural areas have more power than they would deserve just by their population in the national government. Mainly because every state has 2 senators, which means that rural areas are overrepresented in the Senate and also in the Electoral College. But I'd argue that our future is together, although mainly if we can continue to focus on common interests. So who's a model of how this might work out? Well, I would say Bob Dole, who's the most famous Kansas politician, and who I'm sure many in the room have met in the past. I myself have not met, although I do study him, particularly in letters that were written to him about civil rights in the 60s that I'll talk about in a minute. Bob Dole was a longtime Kansas politician, served in the House, then in the Senate. He was a Republican leader in the Senate, ran for president 3 times and never successfully, and still is active in national politics. Actually, he was so successful that he got Donald Trump to take a phone call from the president of Taiwan the day after the election, which is something that isn't supposed to happen because we're kind of supposed to go on the fiction that Taiwan is part of China, even though it really isn't. But that was because Bob Dole had been lobbying on behalf of the government of Taiwan with the Trump administration. And Dole was a very successful politician and was a coalition builder. And a lot of what our government does now and how it does it goes back to Senator Dole, particularly the food stamp program, which is basically a rural-urban compromise. That's a bill that is able to get a coalition for a massive federal inflow of money into both in the farm bill, into both rural areas and farming communities, and into to food programs, particularly delivered in public schools. And it was able to do that by basically joining 2 issues together that might not have a majority either side, but together they can. But I want to talk about some models going forward together by looking at civil rights, which is an area that Bob Dole isn't probably known for terribly much, but where he was at the center of. So Bob Dole comes from an area in Russell, Kansas. Russell is a town. I've been there. They have an oil museum. I went to with my kid once. But his district that he represented in the U.S. House was rural at its start, and then got even more rural as that had to take on more population. But even though, and what I study in my own work, that's not, it's more for other academics, but what I study is I look at letters that people write to their Congress people about civil rights in the 60s, looking at the opinion people have about that. And while Bob Dole voted for every civil rights bill that was put in front of him, that is not what his constituents wanted him to do. They thought that the Civil Rights Act, particularly the ones in the late 60s that were involving housing discrimination, were not a good idea, often a communist plot. My favorite one was a woman who argued that we shouldn't allow we shouldn't have anti-housing discrimination legislation because it would allow for brothels in suburban areas, because all you had to do was hire a integrated workforce and then claim and have them live there at that particular house, and then claim housing discrimination if the city tried to shut you down. That also shows that individual citizens often don't understand public policy very well. But Bob Dole wasn't voting against his constituents in a lot of ways and voting for civil rights. He was voting for an area that didn't have a lot of relevance to a lot of his constituents because Northwest Kansas and Western Kansas in general at the time was not an area with a terribly large non-white population, although now, particularly in the Southwest, it is a rapidly diversifying area. And that he voted for the 64 Civil Rights Act, which was actually pretty popular nationwide, the 65 Voting Rights Act, which was also popular, but he voted for the 68 Civil Rights Act, which was a much tougher road to hoe for the progressives. And Dole was a Republican at the time, and most Republicans were strong supporters of the Civil Rights Act. Actually, in 1964, on the big vote in the Senate about civil rights, there were only 4 Republicans of the 42 or so that voted against the Civil Rights Act. The Republicans just happened to nominate one of those for president, Barry Goldwater, and have been below 20% with black voters ever since. And also Dole, when he got to be more powerful in the Senate, was the man who brokered a compromise for the 1982 Voting Rights Act reauthorization. Because the Voting Rights Act, it's statute, it has to be reauthorized. It's basically been permanently reauthorized now since '06. But in 1982, there were real questions about whether it would actually go forward. And Dole was the one that brokered a compromise where he basically was able to get the Southern Democrats to stop blocking it, the remaining conservatives in the legislature, and also to expand the effect of the Voting Rights Act. And that, on a side note, that did benefit his party come in the 1990s, where the Voting Rights Act's requirements of creating majority minority districts led to packing of Democratic black voters in the South, and that led to the Republican Revolution taking the House back in '94. But this is an example of the kind of rural-urban cooperation here, where you have Bob Dole being part of a massive number of rural Republicans who back civil rights, an area that their constituents weren't terribly comfortable with. And also, if it had policy implications, it was in urban areas. It was in places like Wichita, where Dole's district did not extend to. And so this is a model of kind of how we might go forward together. So to look at how this is working in Kansas in the near future. In Kansas, we've had the last few years of a lot of contestation, a lot of different kind of election outcomes, all looking to have some kind of stable majority coalition. Because in Kansas, we more or less had one for about 50 years prior to 2010. Now, the governorship would change between Democratic and Republican. The legislature every once in a while would have Democratic majorities in one house or the other. I think the Democrats got the state Senate for a couple of years in the 70s. They got the state house for a couple of years in the 90s. But you had a kind of stable coalition. So you had governors who were moderate Democrats or moderate Republicans, or moderate Democrats like Sebelius or Bill Graves. You had moderate Republicans. So Bill Graves was a Republican. You also had lots of other kinds of moderate Republicans. And it also was a geographically diffuse coalition. So you would have Republicans who would win seats all across the state. You would have Democrats that would be concentrated, particularly in urban areas, but also would win lots of rural areas and would do well in some suburban areas. After 2010, which 2010, we should note here that except for maybe 2018, depending on how the next few years shake out, 2010 should be seen as the biggest landslide victory in congressional and state legislative elections for a single party in modern American history. Republicans gained hundreds and hundreds of state legislative seats across the country. They swept aside Democrats all over the place. They ended the careers of many Democrats in Congress. They reversed all of the gains and then some that the Democrats had made in the Obama election in '06 beforehand. And also quite important and connected to what Gentry recently talked about is that a year ending in 0 is a really bad year to have to do poorly if you're a political party, and that happened to the Democrats. Because what happened was most states had redistricting that was controlled by the Republicans. And so then when you give power over the rules to a political party, they normally then try to rig the rules for their benefit. And our system allows for that. And so what that meant is in state after state, maps were drawn to benefit Republicans. In particular, what they did was lock in the gains of 2010. And it was only with the massive landslide of 2018 that a lot of that was swept away. Just on a side note, in the next redistricting cycle, it's not going to be nearly as positive for Republicans. The Democrats are probably not going to have control of a lot of states, but they're going to be able to do like they've done in Kansas and make it so there's split control, and that either makes a compromise or as more and more likely these days, it sends things to courts. And that's where we're probably heading in Kansas, because the Democrats are going to have at least one seat at the table in the governorship, and the odds of the Democrats getting both houses of the legislature with a stable majority are near zero. And so we're likely to have split party control, which will probably send it back to courts again. And also there are several states that have adopted redistricting commissions since the last cycle, and that will give us likely more competitive elections. So this post-2010 coalition here in Kansas was basically, which we often think of as the Brownback years, although I think Governor Brownback gets more credit or more blame for what happened under his watch than he deserves. If you would have another conservative Republican governor, they likely would have done about the same kind of things. The tax cuts were something that was very popular in the legislature. The state house was elected in 2010, then the state senate elected in 2012, where even though the Senate moderates didn't have to deal with gerrymandering that the House wanted to try to defeat them, most of them lost anyway in 2012. With the one important exception being Carolyn McGinn, just north of us. Although in that, the 2016, the moderates revived. So we had this period where it looked like that the Republicans might have a stable coalition that was a conservative coalition that could unite on public policy, and that would unite around cutting taxes, reducing regulation, and also furthering social issues from a conservative position. And it would have a lot of strength in suburban areas and dominate in rural areas. What we saw in the 2016 election that wasn't a stable coalition. Republicans lost a whole bunch of seats in suburban and urban areas to Democrats. Conservatives lost to lots of moderates in primaries. The Democrats clawed back even some of the stuff they'd lost in rural and small town areas, although in 2018 they lost most of those seats by very narrow margins. And so we saw a revival of the moderate Democrat coalition, which overrode Governor Brownback's veto on taxes, and it seemed to set things back to possibly where they were pre-2010. Although if you look at the 2018 elections, Democrats gained a little bit in the state house. I think they came out after the election with a 1 vote gain, although that gets them barely to a third of the seats. They picked up one of the switchers, Stephanie Clayton. But the conservatives actually gained strength because they clawed back in primaries a lot of what they'd lost. And so we have really not a whole lot of idea about any kind of stability going forward. It seems like there's some stability around the idea of taxes more or less the way they were before Brownback, and public education supported. But a lot of that's because the state Supreme Court has been pushing. But on issues like Medicaid expansion, it's not clear where things will go. Probably in a more conservative direction, but pass a Medicaid expansion compared to other states. But particularly with abortion being more and more important and salient in public policy, not so much because of what's happening here, but what's happening nationwide with other states, and with possibility of the Supreme Court moving away from Roe v. Wade, we could have all kinds of interesting, complicated issues. And so to return to where I started with the last governor's election, started out talking about how a lot of seats look like them have big Democratic advantages or big Democratic opportunities. And maybe one example will be in Jim Denning's district, which is in the Johnson County area, where Laura Kelly won 60% of the two-party vote there. You can tell that Denning, who has been a very conservative senator for his career, is now moving. He supported larger taxes, larger public school spending, and he also, while passing on Medicaid expansion, and he could have brought Medicaid expansion above the line, got it to the floor with just his support, and it would have passed this last time. But he decided that he's going to basically engineer a kind of discussion and kind of consultative process across the state, and it looks like Medicaid expansion will pass in some form in the next session. But in all these districts, look at the margin that Donald Trump won there. And Trump, this is when he's winning not a majority nationwide, a lot of votes, 46%, but still less votes than the Democrat Hillary Clinton. But all these districts, actually Trump won a majority, and some by a substantial margin. And also Republicans will likely have incumbents, if not that, experienced candidates in all these districts. Like my district, the 30th district in Wichita is one in the state Senate district where there are several decent candidates who live in that district, but getting state representatives to risk their seat to run for a state Senate district will be difficult. The Democrats' bench in these kind of areas is sometimes somewhat weak because of long periods of atrophy. And so looking forward, the likelihood in the future of Democratic growth in suburban areas is substantial. But however, there's a good chance that what we saw in 2018 is probably the peak of the Democratic strength in Kansas, at least at the gubernatorial level. And we'll probably get ourselves back to the kind of politics that we had, that we saw before Brownback, which is one of moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans negotiating some kind of compromise, but one which is always able to collapse, particularly over social issues. And so we want to end with another quote from the late John Bartow's inaugural address. And here I want to substitute state, instead of university, I want to broaden out and substitute state instead of faculty, because we as faculty aren't that important when you think about it statewide. Talk about people. If you think about Kansas, it's a great state. It's got great people, it has a huge future, and then the stuff about the state motto. But this is really only possible if we understand that rural, urban, and rural metropolitan cooperation is necessary to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. A couple of just announcements. I want to let everyone know at your leisure, please come take advantage of the refreshments around the room. We haven't built in a break time, but feel free to do that. And the restrooms are just out the double doors to your right if you're wondering where the restrooms are. One more announcement. I understand that we have one of our representatives in the room today, Representative Henry Helgerson. Henry, would you wave your hand and be recognized? Thank you very much for coming out, and I'm sure you're enjoying some of this political talk about how the political boundaries are drawn and how you play in that. So we're going to shift gears just a little bit and start talking about economics. And how the rural and urban areas geographically are separated from each other, but how that connectivity plays such an important role in the push-pull factors, as well as just our labor basin and how we benefit from the commuting patterns and the interconnectivity of our rural and urban communities. So to shed some light on that for us this morning, I am going to welcome to the stage Mr. Mike Bush. He's the Senior Research Economist with CEDBR with the Frank Barton School of Business at Wichita State. Welcome, Mike Bush.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I appreciate this opportunity to share some of the research that we've done at CEDBR. And we'll be looking at identifying some economic linkages between rural and urban areas, specifically looking at retail sales and retail stores as a way that links urban and rural areas. Now, I grew up on a farm in rural Iowa, which is fairly similar to rural Kansas in most ways. And we lived probably about 5 to 10 minutes from a small town. So we'd go there to buy most of our grocery store. There was a tiny hardware store downtown, and we get things that we needed on the farm, tools and things. But when we wanted to do the big shopping for the year, like when I was a kid, we'd do back to school shopping. I have to drive about an hour to the nearest metropolitan area to go to the shopping mall. When we got there, I'd go to the shoe store, a store entirely full of shoes to buy new shoes for the year, go to the clothing stores and get some new school clothes for the year. And we're walking around to see the toy store, a store entirely filled with toys, which when you're 8 years old and lived in a rural area, that sort of blew my mind as a kid. But and see some of you are nodding along with that experience, that if you grew up in a rural area, it's a big deal to get to go to the mall. Some of you are looking at like, what's the big deal? It's just a shopping mall. But it's when you live a long ways from that, when that's not there, it's sort of a big deal to be able to go to those stores. So the idea with the research is that despite even the wide geographic distances, and in Kansas we're even more spread out than we were in Iowa, that people are willing to drive quite a long ways for those retail opportunities. So major urban areas act as large centers of commerce throughout Kansas, Wichita, Kansas City, Topeka. These are some of the big major urban areas, and they have the largest amount of retail in the state. They offer a lot of retail goods that aren't available in some of the smaller communities, even small towns that do have retail. They don't have the depth of selection that the larger urban areas do. So there's both increased selection and increased supply make travel attractive in rural communities to get things that you just can't get in your own small town. So the motivation for this research is to see how much really do those rural areas impact retail sales in metro areas. So they have a large effect, or as Evan presented earlier, the rural areas make up an increasingly small part of the overall Kansas population. So does that increasingly shrinking population still have a big effect on the metropolitan area retail? And then also wanted to ask the question the other way around: does metropolitan growth impact rural sales as well? So look at that. We have, and we've seen this map a couple times this morning, that's our metro areas here are in dark green. The micropolitan areas, which are smaller urban centers, in the sort of light green, greenish blue, and then rural counties in white here. And for purposes of this research, I'll be grouping the rural counties and the micropolitan counties together as non-metropolitan counties and comparing those to the metropolitan counties in the state. And for data, we have actual data on taxable retail sales provided by the Kansas Department of Revenue. And in Kansas, this is collected based on actual retail sales and tax receipts collected by county. And in Kansas, taxable retail sales taxes are collected for any retail sale, rental, or leasing of property, as well as labor services to install, repair, apply, or any service to alter or maintain that personal property, and then admissions to entertainment, amusement, or recreation places in the state of Kansas all charge retail sales tax. So when we're talking about taxable retail sales in the state, all these categories are included beyond just perhaps the standard thought of going to the shopping mall and having paying sales tax on your retail sales. So here we have a graph of monthly retail sales for Kansas divided out by metro areas and non-metro areas. You can see that on average, non-metro retail sales are considerably lower than metropolitan retail sales. Part of this is just the population difference between the non-metropolitan and the metropolitan counties. You can see that metropolitan sales have been increasing over time. In part, that's due to population growth, in part due to increasing concentration of retail sales in the metropolitan areas in Kansas. Another feature that I thought was rather notable in this is looking at the seasonal variation over time. You see that there's a big spike about once a year that corresponds to November, December, around Christmas time. There's a lot of extra retail sales. People are Christmas shopping for their kids or whoever else. But when we look at the non-metropolitan retail sales, those spikes are much smaller, even relative to the size that the seasonal spikes are about 2 to 3 times as large for those Christmas sales in the metropolitan areas as opposed to the non-metropolitan areas. Tried some evidence that when making larger purchases, say Christmas shopping, that people in rural counties are more likely to shop in metropolitan areas. So if we look at this on a per capita basis, you can see that in the metro counties have about just over $15,000 in per capita taxable retail sales in those metro counties on average, while the non-metro counties have about $13,000 in per capita taxable retail sales. So about 68% of the Kansas population resides in the metropolitan counties, and 72% of the retail sales happen in those metropolitan counties, which sounds like maybe a small difference, but it does work out to be almost a $2,000 per person difference in retail sales. One theory might be that if non-metro counties have lower incomes on average than metro counties, this could account for some of this disparity. But as we saw in Evan's slides earlier, some of the rural counties have some of the highest incomes in the state of Kansas. So this difference can't really be explained by differences in income, but rather more likely in differences in the patterns for where people choose to shop. So this map is looking at county retail pull factors, and the county pull factor is looking at per capita retail sales in those counties compared to the state average. So a pull factor of exactly 1, which would be represented by the light blue here, if it was exactly 1, that would mean that county has an exactly average amount of retail sales compared to the state average. Pull factors of less than 1, which are represented by the red and yellow, would represent that that county has on average lower per capita retail sales than the state average. And then the blue and green counties represent counties that have a pull factor of greater than 1. So those are counties where the retail sales are, per capita retail sales are greater than the state average. You can see that there's a lot of yellow and red on this map. About more than half the counties are yellow and red and have lower than average retail sales. That's in part because retail sales are concentrated in some of the highest population counties. You can see in particular on this map, Johnson County is green, and that has one of the highest pull factors in the state. In addition, even though Sedgwick County is that light blue, it has a pull factor still substantially above 1, closer to about 1.2. And then some rural counties also have relatively high pull factors, especially out in western Kansas, where you can see that Sherman and Thomas County in the far northwestern corner have extremely high pull factors. And that is likely in part because there are some communities there with retail present, and those counties get to be quite a distance away from some of the other urban centers where there are high pull factors. So if we divide this into 4 categories, looking at the core metropolitan counties for the 5 metropolitan areas, those core counties have pull factors on average of almost 1.2, so substantially higher taxable retail sales than the state average. In the second column, if we look at the outlying metropolitan counties, so counties that are part of the metropolitan areas but outside of the core city county, then we see that those areas have pull factors of about 0.75, so only about 3/4 the state average in terms of retail sales. And we sort of expect this based on what we think about metropolitan areas, that the core county is the core urban area, and the outlying counties oftentimes are filled with what we might think of as bedroom communities, where those communities where people live and they go to the core urban center to work and shop. Then we look at the micropolitan counties. They have pull factors of about 1 on average. So micropolitan counties are relatively self-sufficient perhaps in terms of retail. They're large enough to have enough retail establishments that they have about an average amount of retail sales. When we look at the rural counties, they have the lowest pull factors on average, about 0.7, even lower than the outlying metropolitan counties. So this is some more suggestion that perhaps there's a connection then between rural residents and urban retail sales. So to look at this more rigorously, we wanted to, the core metropolitan area is pulling about 50% of the total population, but about 59% of the retail sales in the state. So it's even more dramatic than just looking at metro versus non-metro areas. So we wanted to look at this a little more formally, looking at linkages between Kansas wages and Kansas retail sales. So I don't want to get too much into the math because I've been told that no one else finds the math as interesting as I do, but I want to give you a little bit of an idea of what we did here. And this first equation and first model that we did was just to see if there's links between wages and retail sales in the state of Kansas, not necessarily looking at a difference between rural versus urban. And what we found, so we used 2 legs of the wages and found that spread out over about 2 quarters, that a 1% increase in wages leads to about a 0.4% increase in retail sales. Looking at if there's a 1 percentage point increase in wages, then spread out over the next 2 quarters, that amounts to about a 0.4% increase in retail sales. So the reason we built the model the way I did is that the effects of wage increases take some time to be felt in terms of the retail sales. We have data here on quarterly wages from the quarterly census of employment and wages. So this counts the wages or any wage that was paid by a company that would be eligible for unemployment insurance. So it excludes some employment, self-employed workers. If anyone's getting paid under the table or something, that obviously wouldn't be included in here either. but we have about 18 years worth of data that we're looking at with this. So to look at the rural versus metro linkages, now the equation here, I've taken metro sales, the percentage change in metro sales each time period, and we're dividing out the effects between metro wages effects on metro sales and non-metropolitan wages on metro sales. So, got the table a little cut off there, unfortunately, but so looking at the effects of metro wages on metro retail sales, we find there's some positive effects. But then when we look at the effects of non-metro wages on metropolitan retail sales, you find that between those two coefficients of 0.14 and 0.32, that a 1 percentage point increase in non-metropolitan wages increases metropolitan retail sales by about 0.47%, or almost 0.5% on average increase in retail sales in the metro areas caused by increases in non-metropolitan wages. So it appears as though, at least based on the correlations we find in this data, that there are substantial links between changes in what's happening in the rural economy and then the retail sales in the urban areas in the state of Kansas. And this is based on data for the past 18 years, so it's possible that this effect might be changing over time. One possible cause for that could be internet sales that Amazon delivers to everywhere in the country in a couple of days now. So it might be easier to live in a rural area and start ordering online rather than going to urban areas to shop. But over this data set, we find that there's still, even up through 2018, are significant effects of non-metro wages on the urban retail sales. I wanted to see also as a test to see if the effect worked the other way. Do metropolitan wages have effect on rural retail sales? Do people from urban areas go to rural areas to shop also? So is there really a bidirectional effect there? And so in this model, just changed out the dependent variable for non-metro sales rather than looking at metropolitan sales. And here we found, so we looked at non-metro sales, and we find that looking at this, that non-metro wages are strongly predictive of non-metro retail sales. But we can see that there's even negative coefficients on the metro wages. So to summarize that, rural wages are strongly predictive of rural retail sales, but metro wages, there's not a significant link there. If anything, it looks like increases in metro wages have a slightly negative effect on rural retail sales, but we can't rule out that that's just caused by statistical noise, and there's no real effect at all going the other way. So we see that there's strong effects of rural wages on urban sales, but not of changes in the urban economy on rural retail sales. So the retail link appears to largely flow in just one direction, from rural economies lead to increased urban retail sales. So I appreciate you all listening to that and looking at all those equations with me, but we've got a couple minutes left, so if anyone has questions, yeah.
With the influence of agriculture in a lot of the rural areas, so are you missing retail sales tax because they don't pay sales tax on their big purchases of combines and tractors? And are you missing wages? They don't pay themselves necessarily wages, like you had mentioned, the self-employment. So to be able to compare those two, are we missing a couple things?
Yeah, so any purchases that are excluded from taxable retail sales are missing from this data. So yeah, if farmers are coming to urban areas to purchase large machinery or something, that would be something that would be left out of this data set, and could be another link that we're not picking up. And then to look at on the rural wages side, we are missing rural wages that are paid to the self-employed. Though in Kansas, Farms Incorporated as a corporation and pays themselves wages that way, they would still show up in the data set. So at least some farmers are represented in the rural wages. Yeah. In the back, yeah, question.
Really big picture, essentially, what you're saying is that people who live in rural areas are coming
Mhm.
shops for the holidays and with a big purposes like automobiles, that kind of thing. They understand that the options are greater for the owners and they're traveling. Suggestion there?
Yeah. So I think that's the implication from this data is that people from rural areas are traveling to urban areas then to make these large purchases. That since we see those effects, that if there's changes in rural wages, that eventually trickles down into or trickles up into changes in urban retail sales. That if there's so I think the mechanism through that is probably larger purchases, since it does require substantial travel time in Kansas to reach major metropolitan areas, that most likely they're traveling for major purchases like automobiles or appliances or other higher cost big ticket items. But we could in the future perhaps do some more detailed research looking at individual sectors of the economy to examine that more thoroughly. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Or I thank you all for the time.
Thanks very much, Mike. If there's one theme I hear recurring with some of our speakers, it starts with, I grew up on a farm in. So with Neil Allen, it was I grew up on a farm in southern Indiana, and with Mike, it was I grew up on a farm in Iowa. And my story is I grew up on a farm in southern Kansas. And so we're going to do a bit of a sociology experiment and also give you a chance to just stretch your legs if you haven't been up for a little bit. I want you to stand if you grew up on a farm in rural America. Right, so we've got about 10 or 12 of you. All right, and so go ahead and sit down, folks. And if you grew up in what you would consider a micropolitan, stand up. All right, about a third of the room. All right, we'll let you guys sit down. And then if you grew up in a metro. All right, so kind of the demographic of Kansas makeup right there. All right, well, when I was growing up on a farm in rural Kansas, I will tell you I got my first lesson in economics when I was about 5 or 6 years old. When you were asked to take something to school for show and tell. And I didn't have anything for the week to take to show and tell. And so my dad, rural Kansas farmer, in his infinite wisdom said, why don't you take a stalk of Milo, this was in the fall, take a stalk of Milo to school and you're going to give your class a lesson in the economics of commodity prices and how that impacts the bottom line. And I was like, what? You want me to talk about what for show and tell? But yes, my first grade teacher on my report card, tells a story about my first economics lesson. I don't know what a great lesson it was, but our next speaker that we're about to welcome to the stage helps us calculate a lot of things using calculations just like Mike showed us. She works on cost benefit analysis. She works on those labor shed studies. She helps us with a lot of things out in the field when we're working on economic development projects. Her name is Patty Bradley. She is the senior research economist with CEDBR at the Wichita State University. So help me welcome to the stage, Patty Bradley.
Hey, good morning. Good morning, and thank you. All right, thank you. Appreciate the time and all of you being here and all of the great information from the previous speakers. Thank you so much. I was actually one of those that grew up in a metro area. I have not spent a lot of time studying rural development and thinking about the economy as a separation between urban and rural. Usually when I think about the Kansas economy, and I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about the Kansas economy, I think about it in a holistic form. All of the inputs and outputs and where they're coming from and where they're going to. So when I was asked to speak on this topic, it was a new one for me, one that I hadn't previously. I'm actually gonna change this up and move this out here. Can you still hear me? All right, I'm gonna move around a little bit. Thank you. When I first thought about this topic, I thought, I am used to thinking of the Kansas economy as a whole, all of the pieces. We take the raw materials that we have, all of the inputs, we use those to create the things that meet the needs that we do with products and services, and how does that all come together? So when they asked me to speak on this topic, I had to stop for a minute and think, okay, we're going to subdivide this whole economy that we have into the parts that come from urban and the parts that come from rural. And what does that look like? So I started where I start with everything. If any of you've heard me speak before, I started with the data, surprise, surprise. So I look at the data for the state of Kansas. And when we look at the data, it is broken out between metro, micro, and rural. So the metropolitan areas in the map that we've been showing you are the ones that are outlined in the dark, bold, solid lines. And a metropolitan area is any city center that has a population of over 50,000 that draws from a labor shed around it. So our larger metro areas, that's the first division. The second division is the micropolitan areas, the ones that you see in the dotted lines around those. And micropolitan areas are a city center between 10,000 and 50,000 that draws from the labor shed around it. All of the other counties that fall outside of that, we will call rural. And by definition, that means those are counties with a population of less than 10,000 without a city center that are not strongly connected through the labor shed with the areas around them. So as I was looking into this, the first thing that I figured out, which I kind of knew before, but came very obvious when I was working on this project, is there's not a lot of data available on rural counties because definition, they are small. So I had to stand back and I looked at the data that was available and say, okay, how does this all come together? Okay. So how I broke it out is by looking at interaction between these areas, our urban, our rural, our micro, and how that comes together, and what is moving between those areas. And the things that are moving are people, our most important asset. And then there is goods and services, because as people, we need goods and services, and all of that costs money. So how is the money moving? So that's how I looked at it. How are people moving between these areas? How are goods moving between these areas? And then how does the money flow? So the first one that I looked at was people. And when people choose where to live and work, we choose where we live and where we work based on many different criteria. And sometimes we live and work in the same area, and sometimes we live in one area and we work in other areas. Family considerations, we prefer living in one environment or another. Housing costs, many, many different things drive that. So when we look at worker retention is that percentage of the population in that area that actually lives and works in the same area, close by, either lives and works within a micro area, macro area, or rural area. So when we aggregate that all together and look at it, the micropolitan areas, those smaller urban areas, about 85% of the people working in those areas actually live and work in those areas. From an economic development standpoint, that's what we go. We want them as closely attached to our community. And if they're both living in areas, rural areas have about 74–75% of the areas actually living and working in that same area. So the lowest level of commuting in and out that we see is in micropolitan, and metro and rural actually have very similar levels of commuting activity. So I look at that level of it, and as I usually do, I say, okay, that's right, that's interesting. What else is going on here? So if we drill down a little bit farther, pull that information to a map, and then start looking at the rural areas, the metropolitan areas, and the micropolitan areas, and you start to see some differences. All the metropolitan areas are not created equally. Some of them have high, very levels of worker retention. You'll see in the city centers, Sedgwick County in the Wichita metropolitan area, you'll see Shawnee County in the Topeka metropolitan area, have very high levels of worker retention within those metropolitan counties. But the outlying counties within those metropolitan areas have very low levels of worker retention. And that's how we define these areas, is a city center with a lot of workers rotating in and out. So lower levels of worker retention. Lower levels of worker retention meaning that there's much higher levels of commuting activity outside of those areas. The other thing that becomes very obvious is on the eastern side of the state, where we have higher population density, we see a much higher level of commuting activity. Many of those red and yellow counties that you see to the eastern side of the state have a lot of commuters, a lot of people moving in and out, back and forth. There is a separation between urban and rural in many areas, but in also those areas, there are same people moving in between the urban area and the rural area, back and forth. Okay. So we look at that level of commuting activity. And as Neil said earlier, the next thought that pops into my head, well, if they're commuting, how far are they commuting? How much? There isn't good data that actually tells us how many miles they're commuting, but the rural areas are spending less time commuting. As was said earlier, they live and work in the same place. So the vast majority of them commute less than a 20-minute commute time. Our metropolitan areas, where there is a higher level of commuting activity, more of them moving in and out, are actually spending more of their workday commuting, the time that they're spending. So that tells us how much, anywhere between 15 and roughly 25% of the population is commuting in between these areas over time. And they're spending on average less than 20 minutes, but there's definitely a significant number, especially in the metropolitan areas, they're spending more than 20 minutes commuting back and forth to work at those times. Now, the next question I asked myself was then, are they commuting in or out? Are they primarily living rural and commuting into micro-metro, which they are, or are they living micro-metro and commuting rural? And the reality is there are workers going both ways all of the time. When you see an employee residence ratio, 1 would mean that geographic area has the same number of workers commuting out as they have commuting in. If it is less than 1, they have more workers commuting out, and if it's more than 1, they have more workers commuting in. So in general, more people choose to live rural and commute into the city centers to work, lifestyle choice. And there are plenty that live in the city centers that commute out to other areas to work, an inward commute to the city centers, an outward commute from the rural areas. So again, in more detail, so what does that look like for each specific county in the area? If I can get it to flip once, there we go. So again, when we see the inward commute, this is why our metro and micro areas are designed the way they are. When the Center of Budget Office actually defines these areas and they say that county is in the metropolitan area because they have an exchange of workers, we can see why that is. We frequently get asked the question, why is Reno County and Cowley County not part of the Wichita metropolitan area? They're not part of the Wichita metropolitan area because both of those counties actually have a very high level of worker retention. They don't have significant commuter interconnections with outside areas. By definition, to be included in the metro area, you need to have those commuter connections. But within every metropolitan area, there are ones that are commuting in and ones that are commuting out. When we look at the rural areas, we also see that same pattern. Many of the rural counties have a high level of worker retention, but there is also some rural counties that have lower level of worker retention. And when we look at the map, again, if you look west or look east, we see many rural counties that have a low level of worker retention, a high or a low level of employee residence, a high level of commuting in and out. And it's very different from the east to the west. It's not necessarily a dividing line, is it urban or rural, but how proximal is it to those big city centers? The commuting activity in the eastern rural counties that are sandwiched between the two metro areas is much higher than when we look at the rural areas in the western part of the state that are farther away from urban city centers. In other words, all rural counties are not created the same. It is different depending on where that rural county is located. We can't say that rural activity in Kansas meets this criteria. It very much depends on where that county is located relative to the other urban areas in the state. Not all rural areas are created the same. So Sometimes we choose to live in one place and work in another place. And sometimes we actually move to that other place. So as we're looking how people are moving around the state, that was the next question I asked myself. We're driving back and forth, and sometimes we don't drive, we actually move. So when I looked at the migration information for this part of it, it is strictly in-state migration. So I took out any international migration, and I also took out any domestic migration. These are people that have moved only within Kansas. So moved from one place in Kansas to another place in Kansas, so it all nets out to 0. So not moving from Kansas to a different state or moving from a different state into Kansas, just how are our communities interacting with each other and where people are moving to. And one of the things that I found very interesting when I looked at this was it runs counter to some of the things that we would have thought. Sedgwick County in particular has a net out migration, a very small one. In many of the rural areas, when we look at only in-state migrations, have a positive migration from urban areas to rural areas. Riley County and Douglas County stand out as big inward migrations. The data doesn't actually tell us who or when, but I saw KU and K-State when I looked at that in my own interpretation, that is probably a lot of young people moving and other migrants around the state. That doesn't mean that there is either, this is different than the population growth information that we talked about earlier, because it doesn't mean that they don't have a net out migration due to migrants leaving to go to other states or other places. So just the interconnection between the two. So if we're going to characterize this for how these migrants work for either metro, micro, or rural, when we summarize that, rural areas lose population to metropolitan areas, a small amount. But the rural areas gain migrants from the micropolitan areas. The micropolitan areas have people choosing to live in the rural areas. We would assume that's a rural area fairly proximal to the micropolitan areas. The micropolitan areas lose, so these ones that are gaining here are the same micropolitan areas that are actually losing to the rural areas. But the micropolitan areas are gaining significantly from the metropolitan areas. The micropolitan areas that are gaining from the metropolitan areas, that is the same loss the metropolitan areas are losing to the micropolitan areas and gaining a small amount from the rural areas. That looks very different than what I expected to see when I aggregated all this together. And again, keep in mind, these are only in-state migrations. So if we looked at how they were migrating out of state, it may look very different. But there are small inward migrations to our rural areas. And it is that connection between, there's city center metropolitan, there is rural, but there's that micropolitan piece in between. Again, the data doesn't tell us why, but we could speculate. Is this a lifestyle choice? Is it where the jobs are available? People frequently move based on school systems, based on family preferences, all different things. How people are choosing to not just work in one place and live in a different place, but move from one place to another place and how they move around the state. The vast majority of these flows were actually from like area to like area. We moved down the block, down the street, into a different neighborhood. The very small portion move out of area to a different area. But that's what I like. When I start getting into data, especially when it's data that I haven't looked at before, and I see something I didn't expect, that's the part that's interesting. I didn't expect for the flows to the micropolitan areas to be so significantly different. Those areas are a very, very important part of our state economy, a very important linchpin in the interaction between metropolitan and micropolitan. They're the areas that aren't strictly one or the other, in between. Okay. So the first part that I looked at is the people. And the Census Bureau data is very available and tells us how the people are moving. The next part I wanted to look at was how do we move goods and services, products from one area to another. And this data was much more difficult to drill into because it's difficult to see. We can't actually see the trucks and the trains moving, and we don't know exactly what's on them. So we intuitively know where some of these things are made and then where some of them are purchased at. The raw materials come from here, the production happens there, but it's difficult to actually drill down and say, these are the interconnections between these specific businesses. Businesses don't readily share their supply chain, so it's much easier, much harder to drill down into that information. So to kind of get an idea of what that might look like, I'm going to show you location quotients. And what a location quotient is just that we have looked at the national economy. On the national scale, these industries are a particular portion of that national economy. And then we look at a local economy, in this case, the county level data. And for the total employment in that particular county, what portion is that industry? And then compare that portion in the local area to how that portion reaches in the national data, and then get an idea, is this industry very highly concentrated, more concentrated than we would expect to see in that local area than it is in the national area? Granted, it is not a perfect way to determine how goods and services are moving, but the rural data is available on this, and we can see some of these patterns and how it rolls. So if the location quotient is less than 0.80, we would say that that industry is very scarce in that area. There's a very low concentration. That area must be getting that good or service from that industry from something else because they're not providing it themselves. Anywhere between 0.8 and 1.2 is about normal in that range. 1 would be perfectly represented as the national economy is. So if it's anywhere in that range, we would say they're producing some and probably consuming some. And then anything over a 1.2, we will call that an area of specialization. That economy has a high concentration of that industry. And we'll use that as a reference point to kind of look at what the urban and rural areas are doing with this. So the very first one that I looked at was natural resources and mining, the production of raw materials. A lot of this is oil and gas. When we look at natural resources in Kansas, a lot of oil and gas production. And it is very clear where that is coming from. Hamilton, Kearney, Grant counties are very high concentrations of oil and gas production. And not surprisingly, when you look at our metropolitan areas, we're not producing a lot of raw materials. There's good land use reasons why those raw materials aren't coming from the same places that we have high concentrations of people, but it is happening in the rural areas. So when we look at location quotients across the state, we see the production of natural resources in the Southwest. Okay. And I took that same data and re-looked at it that way. So the solid line is 1. The dotted lines are our 2 brackets that give us kind of our normal range, and anything above that would be a high concentration. So not a high concentration in many of our metropolitan areas. You can see the high concentration in the rural areas. Kearney County is actually in a micropolitan area, so even though that blue one's there, all 3 of those are highly concentrated together, those counties. So that was natural resources and mining. We know that those raw materials are being consumed in one place and they're produced in another place. The next one that I looked at was manufacturing. So manufacturing across the state, widespread. There is many rural counties in the state that have a high concentration of manufacturing because they're very small economies. By definition, these counties do not have a city with a population of over 10,000. Many of them are significantly smaller than that, a few hundred to a few thousand people. So if they have one manufacturing firm with any significant amount of employment, that gives them a high concentration in manufacturing in that county, much higher than it is in the state. What doesn't show in this data set, which in more detailed data that's available, that's not available at the whole state, we know that even though there's manufacturing widely spread across the state, it is very different types of manufacturing that we see across the state. So we would see food manufacturing in the west, and even Marion County too a bit. There's some aerospace out in Wilson County, high concentrations of aerospace in Sedgwick County. We see more farm and ag equipment manufacturing in the north central part of the state, in different parts. So there's manufacturing across the state, but manufacturing available in metro, micro, and rural areas. Some areas with low concentrations of it, but widely dispersed in all areas. We are producing goods and services. In rural areas, even though they're small economies, there are some things that they are producing. So natural resources and mining, very concentrated rural. Manufacturing, fairly well dispersed across all of it. And the next industry I chose to look at to get a different in range was professional services. This one didn't really look like the other ones. Not really at all. A very, very big difference. When it comes to professional services, so in the professional service industry, when we were looking at this one, we are talking about accountants, architects, attorneys. What is not included in professional services is physicians, but that would be about the only professional degree that is not included in this one. And when we look at this one, it looks very, very different from urban to rural. It might be difficult to maintain a CPA practice in a rural area that doesn't have a lot of clients. And it is very easy for a professional to provide services, electronic data, from urban areas to rural areas. And looking at it by location quotient does not actually mean that everyone in the state of Kansas is getting their professional services from Johnson County, although the map kind of looks like that. We know that they typically could also be going to Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Lincoln, Denver, any of those areas across the state. But a very big difference between how urban and rural areas consume these services than when we look at natural resources, mining, some of the other ones. So in that one, what we would consider an average level of professional services, that is what is between the two dotted lines. And in many, many counties across the state, metropolitan, micropolitan, and rural, there is a very low level of professional services employed in that county. Again, not to say that obviously those services are being provided. They're getting those services somehow, some way, but those professional service providers don't actually reside in the county that they are providing in. Okay, a very different picture. Another production of goods and services is health and educational service. So this, in the data that's available at rural areas, they bring health and education together. So we don't get a look at either one of those individually, and that's a good thing, because if we were trying to look at them individually, most of the data would be suppressed, because there's typically, if there is one rural hospital provider and they don't provide that data. So aggregating that together actually allows us to see it, and you see a very different picture here also. We have some rural areas that have a rural hospital and or a community college or small private university in the rural area. But we have many, many rural areas that not only have a shortage of professional services, but also have a shortage of healthcare providers and a not good, readily close available source of education after the public schools, so higher education or technical college education of those. That looks very different. And again, we would assume that does not mean that they are not getting those services. They're getting those services, but they will need to be coming to an urban area to get them. So there is absolutely a difference, a huge difference in an urban lifestyle and a rural lifestyle. But there's also many ways through commuting patterns, okay, through our production of goods and services and our consumption of goods and services, that rural and urban communities are interacting with each other. It's not necessarily a case of urban or rural, it is urban and rural. There are points of connection between these two. We know that they're getting healthcare. They just have to travel a long way to get healthcare. And they're getting that in the urban communities, those connections where we're all together in those places. So again, some areas with a high level of services, and those areas, it's logical to assume, are providing services to the areas that don't. People are moving back and forth. Okay, so people are moving and goods and services are moving. And one of the things that moves those people and those goods and services is, how does the money flow? How does the money flow in between urban, rural, and micro? So when we look at how the flow of earnings goes, so the flow of earnings mirrors the commuter data that we saw. The commuter data is actually counting how are people moving, who is in the car driving from one place to another. And they're generally doing that for work and get wages for that. And then we take those wages that are earned in one place with a residence in another place, and we make that residential adjustment. Where are the earnings earned, the place of work, and where are the earnings held in the place of residence? And it shows how those flows move across the county. So within the metropolitan areas, we have large city centers that have outflows, and we have large city centers that have inflows. And within the micropolitan and rural areas, there are also some counties that have inflows and some counties that have outflows. We can't necessarily say that all the money is flowing into the metropolitan areas any more than we can say all the money is flowing out of the rural areas. Again, not all rural areas are created equally. Not all metropolitan areas are created equally. Okay. It depends, I believe, more on the specific industry, the specific proximity of that industry to the county line as we're moving. I don't know about you all, but as I'm driving from one place to another, I generally don't think, whoops, just counted across a political boundary. I'm in another county. Nope, I'm not in city of Wichita anymore. We are very fluid about these things as we move, and money flows with that. So if we were going to summarize the flow of earnings, okay, the biggest flows are between the metro areas, okay, with a net gain, net loss in micro areas, and net gain in rural areas. So that's one way to think of the flow of money. Another way to think of the flow of money is financial services. So this is an LQ again, the same way we looked at the flow of goods and services, we looked at the flow of financial. So financial services employment within each one of these counties based on an LQ. And the first thing that jumps out to me is Hamilton and Lane counties, because that looks very different than the rest of rural Kansas. And I will say that there are two big farm credit service agencies there. I had to look what's going on there. So that is specifically farm credit services, which is not financial services that is available to anyone outside of the farming industry, although very much needed out in western Kansas. And it looks very much like professional services does. It's a flow. It is a flow of people, a flow of goods and services, and a flow of money. We are actually all one big economy. Well, I hope that gave you a different perspective on what our Kansas economy looks like and split out between urban and rural. Did anyone have any questions? I have a couple of minutes. Okay, thank you.
I won't need that. I want to close this out. I'm Jeremy Hill, the director. Thank you everyone for coming to participate, for being engaged in conversations like this. I also want to thank all of our speakers who have invested time and efforts to prepare this content. We titled this thing The Great Divide because honestly, when I go from, and I've traveled all around the state doing presentations, I'm on Southeast Kansas, they make comments about Western Kansas. When I'm on Western Kansas, they talk about those urban areas in there. And I go north, they talk about the southern counties. It's surprising how many times you go to a different part of the state, they always say it's us versus them, right? And although there are some similarities, there's also some differences, as Evan showed, right? When you look at rural, you can't see all rurals the same. You can't see all urbans the same. Same thing with Patty. You can't say they're all the same. And when you talk about these economies, we are so interconnected from an economic point of view and a political point of view, as we've talked about, that we really should be calling ourselves, just one Kansas, right? This is one big political and economic economy that has a lot of diversity in it, but they're completely interconnected in many ways. And we should pull apart enough to say, okay, who are we in different areas? How are we connected is the more important question. question. I think that came across. Do you agree? Did that come across how interconnected and how important we are? Yeah? Okay, very good. With that, I want to go ahead and dismiss us. Thank you very much for participating. You will get an email to give us feedback on this, and you're also welcome to come up, talk to any of the speakers after this, and you're welcome to come bring up other ideas for conversations that we should try to do research, bring professors on campus, and even bright students that we have on campus to try to research the questions that you might have. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you again. Got a job?